So this were,
And I am.
it's your, what relative it's your?
She was somebody that meant a great deal to me because she worked for my father, but she lived with us.
Yes.
And when we left Vilna,
Yes.
because we, as I told you, we came here to the World's Fair, she moved in to our
Yes.
apartment, and my
In Vilna, the dominant culture, even among the Jewish intelligentsia, was the Yiddish or the Hebrew culture. In other places, either in Russia or in Poland, let's say in centers like Moscow, St. Petersburg, or Minsk even, the Jewish intelligentsia spoke Russian. In Poland, let's say in Warsaw, in Lodz, Jewish intelligentsia spoke Polish. In Vilna, the intelligentsia continued to use the language of the Jewish masses. Why was this development? How can I explain it? Vilna was a crossroad or a place where many cultures met together. The population of Vilna and the Vilna area was composed of Jews, of Poles, of Lithuanians, of Russians, of Belarusians, and even some other small minorities. And there was a historical struggle between those cultures, which one will become dominant. And under different historical periods, like under Polish, between the interwar period, the Polish was dominant. Before there was the Russian, and the Lithuanian was Lithuanian culture. So in each places when there was not one dominant culture, but there was an encounter of many cultures, the Jews kept their culture. One reason was there were few cultures and they want to keep their own. Secondly, even the Jewish culture in Vilna was at such high cultural standards, that it wasn't worthwhile, let's say, to change this culture for another culture. In other places in Europe, let's say, Western Europe even, when the dominant culture was on a higher level, higher standard, for the intelligentsia, it was some reason why to try to change their culture or their languages and to the other culture. But in Vilna, because it was a culture Jewish center, so this was the second reason, and it was not inferior to the others. On the contrary, it was even superior in some fields than others. So they kept their own culture, and this is the reason why in Vilna we found such institutions like the famous Jewish library, the Strashun Library, which was famous to the whole Jewish world, the Ivo Institute, the Jewish Historical and Ethnographical Society, which Vilna from the very beginning of the 19th century, and then the seminars of teachers, and the writers and the poets wrote in Yiddish or in Hebrew. So the theater was in Jewish theater. So all this together is the reason why we can say that in Vilna was a unique center, and this is one of the reasons why it was called Yerushalayim Delita, Jerusalem of Lithuania, Jerusalem of no other places in the Jewish world received the name of Jerusalem. Look, I have my personal stories from partisan activity, but I don't know whether it is connected with the subject of Vilna vanished city. But so I can tell, but I don't think that they are relevant to this part of the story.
You say you speak about Karczeginski.
Yes.
As being the writer of your unit.
Yes.
When you speak of him as a writer, do you refer to him as a diarist or as a writer, a poet,
Yes.
an essayist? Is he?
Yes. Shmelke Kaczynski was part of the poet group which was called in Vilna the Jung Vilna. And the unit that I was a partisan unit was called the Vilnius. My unit was called Vilnius Unit, on the name of Vilna. And Shmelke Kaczynski reached our unit, and he was appointed actually by the commander of our unit to write the events, what happened in the unit, and also the history of the unit during the contemporary events. And he wrote later published some books. He published a book which was called Partisan Again, which was published in Moscow immediately, I think 44 or 45. There are some stories about even myself. One story is called Mein Liebling, My Love, story of a young boy of 15, 16, which became a partisan. And in some other stories he mentioned also me. And he wrote a lot of material about it. After the liberation, he was one of the people who took the initiative to erect the Jewish Museum in Vilna, he and Sutzkever. And doubtlessly he had a lot of plans to write more about Vilna. I cannot tell you. He was, I think, at least about 10 years older than myself. I think so, but it's easy to find where when he was born.
What's the name of the book?
Partisan Again. Partisan are marching. Partisan in March, maybe. I'm sure the book is in Evo. They have this book. Yeah, okay. Yes. I can tell that, from Vilna ghetto, the first, when they were in the ghetto, they sent to put a mine under the German train. Something. The Jewish underground in Vilna did not only prepare themselves for an uprising in the ghetto, but also carried out sabotage actions while being in the Vilna ghetto. Part of the sabotage actions was carried out in the different factories which produced for the German army, in German army stores. And even an active military action was carried out when 3 members of the Jewish underground from Vilna, headed by Witka Kempner, which later became Abba Kovner's wife, left the ghetto nighttime with a mine and put a mine and derailed a German military train which went to the front line. The Germans, of course, didn't relate this mining activity to Jewish underground, otherwise they would retaliate against the Jews in the ghetto very severely. They related it to the local some partisans from outside, but this was one of the first military actions against the Germans in the vicinity of Vilna. But the underground should be very, very careful, because such actions could finally lead the Germans to find out the underground existing in the ghetto, and this could be ended with an earlier extermination of the ghetto. And the Jewish underground in Vilna was very, very sensitive not to bring an earlier extermination of the ghetto because of their activities. When they were smuggling the arms into the ghetto, there was a question whether they knew that they were endangering the very existence of the ghetto. Because if the Germans would find out there's an armed resistance and the smuggling of arms into the ghetto, they would exterminate the ghetto, liquidate it very, very shortly. With all the economical needs, the importance of the manpower, the working manpower of the Vilna ghetto, when they would know that there is existing in the ghetto an underground, and they have arms, they prepare themselves for uprising, they are leaving the ghetto into the forests, they would exterminate the ghetto earlier. And actually in some cases they captured some Jews and even some group of the underground which left for the forest in 43. And that time they called Gantz and told them, if this will continue, they will liquidate the ghetto. And Gantz that time called some leaders of the inside the ghetto and told them what the Germans said. And the Germans said them, if you will have 50 guns in the ghetto, this will not give any guarantee for your existence. You will be exterminated anyway. Why are you doing such things, stupid things? Gantz said, and this is one of the reasons when the relations between the Gantz and the underground became more wars relations, because that time Gantz started to in some way to limit the activities, the smuggling activities, the escape in the forests, because he, according to his opinion, it endangered the ghetto. And I think that it actually endangered the ghetto. But when the liquidation came, it wasn't because of the underground. The liquidation came because the Germans decided to liquidate all the ghettos in the Ostland and to turn part of them in concentration camps. It was a policy which they adopted in June, July 1943. At that time, although the Kauna ghetto and Shabli ghetto were turned into concentration camps, and the Vilna ghetto was liquidated, except the Kailis and the HKP concentration camps which were left outside the ghetto in Vilna. Yes.
And last time you mentioned from a Jewish national perspective, the uprising
Yes.
was heroic, but from a military point
Yeah,
of view.
yeah. Okay. Okay. When we speak about the importance of the uprising inside the ghettos compared when I would try to evaluate the importance of the Jewish partisan warfare compared to the uprisings inside the ghettos, as an historian and as a soldier, with my military experience, I can say the following. From military point of view, to bring more damage to the Germans, the forest, the partisans activity could do much more than the ghetto uprising. In the forest, you could conduct a prolonged warfare. You could ambush the Germans, blew up trains, the German trains, attack German echelons, and it gave always some more chances of survival, which was proved even historically. But from Jewish national point of view, the uprising in the ghettos, which were pure Jewish uprisings, in the forest, I myself and from other places, from the Jewish partisans which left from Vilna to the forest, we were part of the Soviet partisan movement. In the uprising in the ghettos, there were Jewish uprisings. So from historical importance, the uprising in the ghetto is more important than the partisan warfare. This is the fact that, let's say, the Warsaw Ghetto became an historical landmark in the Jewish resistance movement. In spite that there were a few hundreds people who fought in the ghettos, a few thousands. In the partisans were tens of thousands of Jews. And we blew up together hundreds of German echelons. I myself took part in blowing up 16 German echelons groups and in attacking German garrisons. So militarily, doubtlessly, the damage done to Germans was in partisan warfare. Historically, the Jewish uprising in the ghetto has a much profound historical meaning for the Jews.
I just didn't hear you say, did you say tens of thousands of people in the forest? What number did you give?
Tens of thousands. I can't. In the forest, in the forest of Soviet Union, Eastern Poland, according to an estimate, there are between 25,000 up to 30,000 Jewish partisans. But we can never know the exact number. I would say that all the many Jewish partisans which were in the forest hide their Jewish identity because of existing anti-Semitism even within the partisan ranks and within the local population.
Everybody's choking. Yeah, but it's been very quiet. That are similar, just to see what, different kinds of.
What?
Just, I want to ask you, do you feel that the Jewish community of Vilna was completely destroyed, or is it somehow live on? How do you see it?
No, it's hard to say that the Jewish Vilna community exists. The Jewish community today in Vilna, this is sadly to say, it's Ponar, not Vilna. There are still a few thousand Jews in Vilna, most of them not Vilna Jews, Jews who arrived from different parts of former Soviet Union, from Lithuania itself, from Belarusia. So it's hard to consider the Jewish community in Vilna. But still there is some Jewish life in Vilna till today. I cannot say what will be the future of this. But the Jewish Vilna, this is Ponar today, no more Vilna.
I wanted to ask what you see, if you had to sum up what the legacy of Vilna is, what would you say that is, and why is it important to preserve that? And you can speak in, in concrete material terms or in more conceptual.
I would say that the legacy of Vilna as a Jewish community is to preserve the Jewish life, the Jewish existence, everywhere where Jews still are settled, where Jews still live. Jewish Vilna was a flourishing Jewish cultural center for many generations. The end was a very tragic one. But if there is some message, I would say it is, as Vilna was a Jewish center, let's keep up our Jewish existence everywhere. As an Israeli, I can say that any nation should base its future on knowing its past. And Vilna is an important part of our past, of our historical part, of our roots. Therefore, the history of Vilna should be taught in our schools as an example how a Jewish community in a strange environment succeeded in very adverse conditions to preserve its Jewish identity, and not only to preserve, but to develop a flourishing culture in Yiddish and in Hebrew.
You said last time, I can't remember exactly how you said it, but you said that the Jewish people have gone on because of stories told from fathers to sons, and
Yes.
the story stops.
Yes, okay. The very existence for the Jews along all the generations was based on what was said in the Haggadah of Pesach. You said, V'higatta lebincha, you should say to your son. And the very existence of Jewish people along all the history was because our parents, our grandparents succeeded to to transfer our unique story of our existence, of our religion, of our life, from father to son and son to grandson. And in families where this stopped to tell the story, they actually stopped to be to exist as Jews. And so this story of our past, of which Vilna is part of it, should be continued to say to our children, because this is the condition for our future existence. In Yad Vashem, we erected the Valley of the Communities. The importance of it is that it's impossible to understand what happened during the Holocaust without speaking what was destroyed, what was the Jewish life before the Holocaust. It's important to speak about the history of Jews in Vilna during the Holocaust without saying what was Vilna before the Holocaust, what was destroyed, the values, the culture was destroyed, the people. So this is the task of the valley of the destroyed communities, which in the center of the valley is the house of communities, where the history of each Jewish community will be told by audiovisual means, by books, by films. And at the valley, Vilna is engraved on a big wall and stones, the name of Vilna, with all the communities around Vilna. But Vilna is a special stone, where the name is Vilna, Vilnius, and Jerusalem of Lithuania, Yerushalayim, Delita. And people who visit today the valley, and there are thousands of people almost every day, they came across this place, and because it's the only place which is called Yerushalayim, Jerusalem of Lithuania, this arises interest, what was the uniqueness of Vilna. I think I spoke about it when we spoke about the cultural, it was the Jewish intelligentsia was its own. And also from the very beginning we spoke of the uniqueness of Vilna during the Holocaust, which it was a strong Judenrat and a strong underground, and all this makes Vilna different. It's like a microcosmos of the whole problems. Any problem which the Jews faced in the Holocaust, you can find in Vilna.
I was saying before the war.
Before the war, I can return again what I said before, that Vilna was, as I said, I said it already, that the uniqueness of Vilna compared to all the other cities was that Vilna, the Jewish, the simple people and the intelligentsia spoke the same language. The Jewish intelligentsia wrote and were active for the Jewish masses because they wrote in the language that they could read, that they understood. And while in most of the other cities in Eastern Europe, let's say in the Polish, from Warsaw, of Lodz, or even of Lvov, the Jewish intelligentsia wrote and spoke in Polish in the more eastern parts, east of Vilna, in Minsk, Moscow, or let's say Vitebsk, St. Petersburg, Leningrad. Intelligentsia spoke Russian and wrote in Russian. Vilna, till its very end, till the Nazi period, continued to be a center of Yiddish culture. I mean, Yiddish, Hebrew, national culture, and there was not a gap between the masses and the intelligentsia, where other places it was. There was very little assimilation in Vilna. This was one of the reasons. And this makes Vilna unique. And this may be the unique which created all the cultural assets of Vilna, like the Ivo, and I mentioned the Strashun Library and the Jewish Historical and Ethnographical Society and all that teacher seminars and Hebrew schools and secondary Jewish schools and everything which in Vilna existed. And the majority of the youngsters in Vilna went to Jewish national education.
Is there anything that you feel is important to address that we haven't asked you about in terms of Vilna and your knowledge about it?
I think that we encompassed all the problems that I can remember now.
Do you feel like singing the parts of the song, or should we wait for the
What?
I was going to should we wait for the chorus? I was going to ask you about Sutzkever.
Yes.
Do the Israelis think of Sutzkever as their poem? You know, when we talk
Yes.
about it,
Yes.
the tape was on.
Okay.
Is he considered a Yiddish Holocaust poet, or is he thought of in Israel as their poet?
Sutzkever, Avram Sutzkever is known in Israel. He's known in Israel as an important Yiddish writing poet. He writes in Yiddish. He is the editor of the Golden Acade. And among, I would say, the intelligentsia in Israel, he is known. The problem is that our younger generation doesn't speak, doesn't read in Yiddish. So, and part of his works were translated into Hebrew. Parts weren't translated. So, for the white public, for the younger generation especially, they don't have an approach to his writings. But still, he is known. He's in Israel. He's very high estimated in government circles and academic circles. And he had his work done in Israel in order to preserve the Yiddish culture was of the highest importance. And we can see now in Israel, in some way, a revival of the Yiddish culture. For many, many years, especially before the Holocaust, there was a struggle between the Yiddish and Hebrew. While the Zionism preached to go back to Hebrew culture, and let's say there was a large segment of the Jewish population, especially all the Yiddish parties like the Bund Party and Coalition Left, which saw the continuation of the Yiddish language. So it was a competition between them, a struggle. So in Israel, for years, in the beginning, the Yiddish was almost, let's say, a language that should be replaced by Hebrew. Today, with the understanding of the richness of the Yiddish culture, there is a revival of the Yiddish culture. Of course, it will not become a language, daily language spoken. But still, in the academic level, the Yiddish will be taught, is taught already in schools, in the universities, as an important source of our historical past. Like also the Ladino language, which the revival, which the Sephardic Jewish community spoke in the diaspora.
Do you think, this is just interesting, do you think that the Israelis felt that the Yiddish language was the language of the destroyed, the poor world, the assimilated, the world that was oppressed, and therefore they felt that the Hebrew was the language of freedom?
No, the Hebrew is. The Zionism was the idea was to revive our historical past in establishing a new state in Israel. in our historic land. So when we go back to the history, it was connected also to go back to our historical language, and it was Hebrew. We couldn't speak about Zionism, but the revival of our old dreams to Zion without going back to the language. But still the Yiddish was a very rich culture, and therefore there is, when I spoke about revival today, it is in order to be more acquainted with this rich Jewish culture, which is part of our national culture.